most of us who have been associated with the military, and I'd share with you, I've had 6 tours in the Washington D.C. area, so I'm very familiar with the Pentagon. There's lots of fat to cut. Here's the concern: don't cut the bone. You can cut to the bone, but don't cut the bone. And one of the concerns we're way past time when we can do more with less. Because we're doing less with less. And if we want to rebuild our military, we need to put the resources into it.
Let's go.
Welcome to Citizen. We have a very special guest today, General Dave Deptula. You've been around the block a little bit. We'll get into your whole career and everything in a moment. But first, let's start with you. Where'd you grow up?
Well, first, thanks for having me on today. I really appreciate it. I was an Air Force brat, so I grew up around the nation. When people ask me that, it's kind of difficult. Those of you who've been associated with the military family know that. But I was born in Dayton, Ohio, back in 1952, and then basically lived all over the United States, Minneapolis, Minnesota, out in Albuquerque, New Mexico, up in the Washington, D.C. area, down in Florida, other parts out west in Arizona, and multiple times in Florida. So Tennessee, I'd throw that in there too. So all over the United States.
And your both parents or just one were in the military?
No, my dad was in the Air Force. He's a World War II veteran.
So Army Air Corps, then Air Force, probably, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. He was an aircraft maintenance officer out in the Pacific, working on B-24s and B-29s.
Wow. And then, I mean, usually I'll ask people what made them join the military, but in this case, it seems like it might be a foregone conclusion. But you went to university first, and you did their ROTC. Was it an Air Force ROTC program back then? Because you never know.
Yeah, University of Virginia, Mr. Jefferson's University, and I was a member of ROTC back then. Interesting bit of a story. I was one of 10 pilot candidates at the time. And about 2 months before graduation, which was 1974, we got word that, hey, because of the drawdown of Vietnam and all the pilots that they had, there'd be a delay before we went to flight school. And even though many of us had been on full ROTC scholarships, they were trying to get rid of people coming in to be pilots. And so they offered all kinds of incentives to leave, but I really wanted to fly. So I stuck around, applied for a master's degree because I knew I was eventually going to have to get one if I went on active duty. And so I got an educational delay, stayed on board, and 2 years later, after multiple times asking me if I would get out, I finally got offered a pilot slot. And out of those 10 pilot candidates, I was the only one that ended up going into the Air Force and getting a pilot slot.
Oh wow, that's crazy. Yeah, I mean that's pretty. Even now with so many more aircraft than we used to have, it's super competitive, and you don't know if when you go into the flight program, if you're going to end up flying drones at Creech Air Force Base or something versus an F-15, 16, 18, so on.
That's right.
Is there a I've always wondered about this. I've never we've had plenty of Air Force people on. I've never asked anybody this. Is there somebody that's considered to be the father, I guess, of the Air Force? Because for the Army, it's typically Baron von Steuben, right? For the Marine Corps, it's Samuel Nicholas. He was the first commandant of the Marine Corps. For the Navy, I agree with you. I think it's Jefferson, right? And for paratroopers, we always said Ben Franklin because he's the one that came up with the idea to jump out of hot air balloons onto the enemy behind enemy lines. But I don't know if I've ever heard a story about who, like who, like the Air Force, where did that come from?
Oh man, are you kidding me?
I really don't know. No, tell me.
It's
I'd love to
got
hear
to
it.
be. Well, thanks for asking the question. It is got to be Billy Mitchell, who was the early pioneer of the Air Force and felt so strongly about what was going on in the 1920s and the disregard for, at the time, aviators from both in the Navy and in the Army, in the disregard and a lack of safety that he ended up getting court-martialed over the whole issue.
Yeah, 1925. Crazy.
Yeah.
Because he was
very
talking
good.
so
And
much
there's
trash.
Yeah, well, there's a great movie out there starring Jimmy Stewart called The Court Martial of Billy Mitchell. So it's entertaining even for those who aren't Air Power fans. So I encourage your audience to watch that. And there's a new book out by a guy by the name of John Olson that talks about Billy Mitchell and other Air Power pioneers. Matter of fact, it's called Air Power Pioneers from Billy Mitchell to Dave Deptula. So I'm happy to be a part of that book.
Yeah, that's incredible. I assume you've also read The Bomber Mafia by Malcolm Gladwell, right? Just
Yep.
how he details the transition in World War II, because we are so spoiled. Those of us who fought in the GWAT are so spoiled that we've never been in a conflict where we didn't have air superiority. And so you say if somebody is a fan of the Air Force or air combat or whatever, air power, if you're not, then you haven't been in a gunfight. I'll tell you that much, because there's nothing quite like hearing an Apache or an A-10 coming around with those very distinct noises they make. At any rate, yeah, so that's a really interesting story. So you... Billy Mitchell. I'm going to have to look more into that. I think I actually have seen that. I
think it's a 1952 film.
Yeah.
I mean, it's old, but it's colorized, and it's very entertaining.
Wasn't-
and it happens to have the added value of being true.
Yeah, and he was what do you call it? I think a major general in the Air Force at the time, I would imagine, when he made that, probably, right? Because he didn't actually, I don't think he actually left military service until 53 or 56, somewhere in that range.
No, Mitchell actually
No, I'm
died.
Jimmy Stewart. I'm sorry. Jimmy Stewart, not Mitchell.
Yeah.
So
No,
that's
he was
interesting.
a major, I believe, a major general in the Air Force Reserve.
So let's talk about, get back to you a little bit and your career. You've been a lot of places over the years. Obviously, we detailed some of it where you stayed on for the master's program and then got into flying birds. What was your first aircraft?
Well, I was very fortunate in that when I finally did get asked to go into flight school, that was in early 1976. And because of that 2-year delay, when I graduated, I was in only the third class of brand new lieutenants who were assigned or picked to fly the F-15C, which was, I guess, and to a degree, of course, I'm dating myself here, but it was the Air Force's premier air superiority platform. That title now really belongs with the F-22. So I went off to fly the F-15C, and this and about $4 will get you a cup of Starbucks. But I'm the only Air Force officer who was fully combat mission qualified in the F-15C at every rank from lieutenant to lieutenant general. So I flew the F-15C my entire career. And that is relatively unusual because pilots still generally switch around from one airplane to another.
Yeah, that's pretty common. Why was it that you stayed in a single primary aircraft? Was it your choice or needs of the Air Force, or
No, it's really. I mean, look, you've been in you've been in the military. You don't get a whole lot of choices, and that was true in my case too. It just happened to be that, and I don't know how much you want to go into it, but I mean, I can do a very condensed version of my career. But I had the really good fortune of going between operational assignments and then headquarters staff assignments. And for whatever reason, I always went back into the F-15. So I got requalified over my career actually 6 times in the airplane between different assignments.
Yeah, that was always my concern, actually, when I decided to join the Army. I had a degree. I actually had been to school twice before that. And, just chatting with my friends, people that I knew that were already in the infantry, it's different. I mean, if you're an officer, maybe as a second lieutenant, you get to do a little fighting. Then maybe again as a captain, unless you go to special forces or a tier 1 unit, then that's pretty much it for you. Fighting days, you're doing paperwork and planning from then on out, and that wasn't really what I was interested in. So I enlisted instead. Obviously, I mean, maybe that was the right choice. Maybe it wasn't. My body tells me it wasn't, but the experience certainly was something that I preferred. Yeah, that seems like an extremely lucky turn of events for you to be able to get back.
No, it
in the
was,
aircraft.
I could go on for a long time and speak to the virtues of being a senior officer and competent enough. And the reason it's important that I emphasize being fully combat mission capable as a 3-star, that is very, very rare. And what that means is, I happened to be co-located at that time with an Air National Guard unit who were flying F-15s, and that's what allowed me to maintain that mission qualification. Because at the same time, I was the warfighting headquarters commander out at Pacific Air Forces. But I flew with them, once a week. And so when you get to be trusted by the captains as a 3-star, and oh, by the way, when you're out flying fighters, when you walk into the briefing room and you go out and you fly, you leave your rank outside the door of the briefing room. And it's all about competence. And so there's a trust that develops and a relationship where, the captains can explain to you what their beefs are, but then because of the perspective that you have as a senior officer, you can also explain to them some of the rationale and vice versa. Because I would find out things going out and flying in a line unit about things that I would never otherwise have gotten insight to sitting in my office as a 3-star general. Because as you may know, the higher and higher you go, the more and more insulated you get, and people tend to pound more stuff in different places than you get the actual reality of what's going on. So that relationship, I found, was enormously valuable. And I just wish that more senior officers would maintain that kind of tie to what's going down on the line more often than not.
So I just want to, I want to bring this up and then get to the point you're making right there about the insular nature of being a general officer. But first, we got to talk about Top Gun Maverick, because a lot of people give that movie heat because Tom Cruise at the time of filming, I believe, was 57 years old, which is the age you were when you retired and you were still qualified on the F-15C. So technically, you're the real-life Tom Cruise, and it is possible, although you weren't a captain at the time. I think if you had done that many years in service and were still a captain, that might be a problem.
Yeah.
Moving on to the next one, though, this is something I'm always interested in when it comes to general officers, because it can be a silo of information. It can be you can get tunnel vision from time to time because, again, you go down to the troop level and say, hey, how's everybody doing? And their local command has instructed them on what to say a lot of the time, so it's not easy to get the best answers. How do you overcome that? I mean, your situation was unique because you were a literal fighter pilot, and that is a straight meritocratic situation, right? But it's not always like that in the rank and file of the military outside of that. So what would your recommendation, I guess, be for other general officers and just, field grade officers in general to overcome that insular nature?
Well, it's a wonderful question, and it is highly dependent upon. I got to tell you, the first thing that comes to mind, the first word that comes to mind is trust, and trust is built on competency and genuineness. So I understand not every senior officer is going to have the opportunity to have what I happen to have, and that was the good fortune of being co-located with a unit that was flying the same airplanes. I could get requalified, and I went out, and you develop trust and competency by evidencing a degree of competency that the folks at lower ranks appreciate. And so that is part of that. Now, it doesn't mean that you can't develop those kinds of relationships if you're not in that kind of situation, but it takes effort on the part of the senior officers to do that. And it is beholden on the senior officer to achieve and strive to gain that level of trust, to get the junior, and not just officers, but enlisted as well, to sit down and share candid perspectives. But it ain't easy. It really isn't.
Yeah. I mean, just people like to bitch and moan about, command all the time. But if you saw the schedule, I think if you just had access to the schedule and see how it starts at 4 a.m. and ends at 7 p.m. every single day, then maybe you would have a little bit more patience for getting some of this stuff done. Because it is, every general officer I know, I look at, they never complain about it, by the way, but you see their schedule, you're like, what the hell? How do you get anything done? And then what you're discussing right there is something that's really important. It's not just for the military, but even if you're wherever you're a leader, especially when you're at a top level, if you're a CEO of a company or if you're just the head of your household, it doesn't matter. These lessons kind of hold true, and it's especially true, at least in the military sense, when you have extremely competent non-commissioned officers, because they're on the ground gaining experience, and like you said before, that is a two-way street of communication. You bring a 30,000-foot view of what the actual plan is, so they can then contextualize their experience and then give it back to you. I think it's a really important process, and we used to have some stuff built into our systems that were really good like that. For example, the infantry basic training for Marine Corps and Army in Vietnam. Typically, when you came off a long rotation as an infantryman in Vietnam, you would immediately go to the drill sergeant trail. Right, guys would go to SOI in the Marine Corps, or they would come to infantry school in the Army and say, here's what's going on in Vietnam right now. Here's tactics, TTPs, so on and so forth. And we're not really in a period of high deployment frequency at the moment, but it does seem like that was a very effective way to go about things. And I wonder if there isn't some opportunity to do that in the future as well.
Well, I think there may be. Unfortunately, and I know that we're going to get here a little bit later on, given all the threats that are out there in the world today, we might have the opportunity to do that sooner rather than later. By the way, one correction, and I don't want to, but it wasn't Jimmy Cooper who played, or not Jimmy Cooper.
Stewart.
Yeah, it wasn't Jimmy Stewart. It was Gary Cooper who plays the lead role of. I looked it up online, but Court Martial of Billy Mitchell, 1955 is when the film was made.
I'll definitely be watching that. Awesome. There you say you were kind of intimating there for a second that there may be some opportunities. What I'm hearing from people in NatSec, and more so from people in the Army at all levels, especially from JSOC and TRADOC, those two organizations specifically, that the entire U.S. apparatus is now preparing for a potential near-peer conflict, meaning China, Russia, something like that.
Right.
What are your thoughts on that? Do you think that's a realistic thing, or are we just trying to reset after the GWAT?
No, I really do not believe it's a reset after GWAT. The fact of the matter is that the Chinese in particular have not just are now, but have been over the last decade, accelerating their military capabilities as well as their aggressive nature in terms of expanding their areas of influence. Many years ago, people talked about them being a regional threat, where if you go back and you do some reading of President Xi, you'll see that his intentions are to become the premier country and offset the United States as a global superpower by 2049, which is the 100th year of the founding of communist China. So these are real concerns. I don't think I have to tell this audience what's going on in Europe and Putin's aggression in the largest conflict on the European continent since World War II. I mean, I think people were amazed when this happened, but now we're talking upwards of over 1 million casualties if you include both sides, and losses accumulating at the rate of 1,000 to 2,000 people per day. You've got Iran out there who's working very diligently. If they don't already have the capacity or the capability to build a nuclear weapon, they just might be hiding that and the potential consequences in the Mideast. And then you've got Kim Jong-un in North Korea, who's already built a nuclear capacity and is brandishing that weapon. So there are multiple opportunities, and I tell folks, you know, there was a National Defense Strategy Commission that was assembled last year, and they talked about how we've never faced a series of threats as challenging as we are facing today since the end of World War II. I would argue with him that, in fact, it hasn't been since the end of World War II. It's in the history of the United States of America, we've never faced a more significant or serious set of threats than we're facing today.
Yeah, I would definitely agree with that. I mean, World War II, we didn't have two rogue states either rapidly approaching or in possession of nuclear weapons. So I mean, I don't think you can really compare it to any other time. And obviously, we don't want to get involved in any serious conflicts if possible. But you know, part of that is realizing that a good defense is a great offense, right? And that's you know, overwhelming military power is certainly something that has done well for us in the past regarding avoiding conflicts. Although, you know, in a couple of periods like the containment phase of the Cold War and then here recently, it does tend to precipitate more minor conflicts, particularly when we overextend ourselves or make bad foreign policy decisions. We tend to do that from time to time, unfortunately, especially more so the intelligence agencies than the military, obviously. But it does tend to invite some smaller conflicts sometimes, but those are more manageable. What do you think we need to do? Well, first of all, do you agree that overwhelming firepower, I guess, as a nation is the best defense? And then two, what do you think we need to do to improve that power to stave off, you know, some serious conflict?
Well, let me offer that, yes. I would say it in just a tad bit. I'd say it in a different, it's the same thing in a different way. What we need to be able to do is to deter conflict. The only way you deter conflict is by being strong, because what that does is induce uncertainty into the minds of your adversaries. If the adversary thinks that they can defeat us, they'll do it, period, dot. If there's a question, and the only reason that they would question whether or not they could do so would be because of our strength and the fact that, holy cow, I don't want to take that on. You know, I really don't want to take that on because I might lose, and that would have disastrous consequences. Here's the dirty little secret that unfortunately too many folks in the United States don't understand, because they're going on living their lives, working, and we can talk about the economy and whether it's good or bad, but you know, for the last 3 decades, they've been doing pretty well. Unfortunately, over the last 3 decades, since the end of Operation Desert Storm, the first Gulf War back in 1991, the United States military writ large, and I'm going to speak a little bit more specific about the Air Force because I'm very familiar with it, is less than half the size that it was in 1991. All right? A matter of fact, if you look at Air Force combat forces, our fighter squadrons are down over 60%. Our bomber forces are down over 65%. The United States Air Force is the oldest, the smallest, and the least ready it's ever been in its entire history. And I dare say, well, I know this is a fact that, the average John or Susie Q public doesn't understand that. A little anecdote. So, I go see my chiropractor a couple days ago, actually a couple weeks ago, and she's brand new. And she asked me what I do. And I said, well, look, I run this think tank that's focused on air and space power. And she goes, oh, yeah, really? Well, you got a website? So I give her my website. And she goes on board and she listens to one of the podcasts that I do. And I come back for an appointment the next week, or maybe every other week. I'm not that bad off, but, and she starts reciting to me. She goes, Dave, I had no idea that our Air Force was that bad. I thought we were the biggest, the strongest, and the meanest person on the street or force on the street. And she goes in and she starts reciting some of these statistics, so I know that she actually was listening. And so I think people find that amazing. And if we keep on going down this track, and oh, by the way, the Air Force is the oldest, smallest, and least ready, and guess what? With the current budget, the plan is for it to get even older, smaller, and less ready over the next 5 years. So some of us have been trying to raise and wave the flag of concern that, look, the nation needs to rebuild its military. And yeah, I'm an airman, but I've also had the good fortune of being a Joint Task Force commander twice, commanding soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines in combat. And so what we need a strong Air Force for isn't just because it's in the best interest of the Air Force, and you alluded to it earlier. It's because all of our military forces, when we go to fight, we operate in an integrated fashion. And you need that. And my Army friends, I can remember being on the Commission on Roles and Missions, and I was a colonel at the time. I had a good Colonel Army friend. He goes, hey, no one wants a stronger Air Force than I do.
Yeah.
They're going to kick the enemy's ass so that I don't have to jump in there and do it myself.
No.
So I'm sorry to go off on that.
No.
But I mean, the fact of the matter is we need a strong military. And we have been underfunding it for way too long. Look, I know that everyone has a position on guns versus butter. And most likely, most Americans won't argue with the Constitution. There's some out there that will, but I'm here to tell you, here's what it says in the preamble of the Constitution, that we form this government to, quote, provide for the common defense, comma, promote the general welfare, unquote. Unfortunately, the way our Congress has been spending is as if those lines have been reversed. And so we need to get back to first principles and build a military that can deter conflict. Because the only thing more expensive than a first-rate military is a second-rate military. So hope folks will think about that for a little bit.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, the Air Force seems to be, and this is my anecdotal experience, I don't have any data to back this up, but it seems to be the branch that fluctuates the most with regard to personnel over the course of a 20-year period. I think they did a bunch of early outs in the late 90s, and then they did another bunch of early outs in the 2015s, and even with like blue to green programs, sending Air Force personnel over to the Army and stuff like that. That's never made a lot of sense to me because, again, I'll bring the point back up. Air and naval superiority are collectively worth more than any infantry that you could ever assemble, right? Like it's infantry standing in open ground is not a threat to the Air Force. It's just not. Like when you have a strong Air Force. It's never made a lot of sense to me that, and you mentioned a couple of statistics, fighter squadrons are down 60%, bombers over 65. It kind of sounds like, one, we need a policy shift, obviously. But two, we need a Bill Knudsen, somebody that's for those of you who don't know who Bill Knudsen was, he's the guy who was hired. He was a general manager of Ford at the time. He kind of ran all their warehouses, and I think he went to GM after that. And he was hired by the government and made a lieutenant general and said, hey, we need bombers now. We're not going to win this war. And he made it happen, right? I feel like we need something like that to happen. I'd love to hear your thoughts on that because we're clearly not ready. I mean, we do have a large Air Force and a large Air Force or a large air wing inside the Navy and so on. But answer those questions for me first, and I'll get to my next one. Yeah,
well, first let me share with you that, I spent almost 35 years in the Air Force. I believe in the virtues and values of capitalizing on air and space to meet our national security needs. But I also believe, and you'll never find a stronger proponent of joint warfare than I am. So I believe that we as a nation need the strongest Army, Navy, Air Force, Marine Corps, and Space Force in the world. But that doesn't mean that everybody gets to play all the time like Little League rules. The reason it's important and the reason jointness is so important is having those capabilities allows a Joint Task Force commander to select among them to formulate the best combination needed to meet a particular contingency. So, I go back to the global war on terrorism. Okay, the preponderance of forces in Iraq and Afghanistan were Army forces. Well, that's fine. But here's the deal. What went along with that is for the 20 years post 9/11, the United States Army got $1.3 trillion more than the Air Force, and the spending on the Navy was over $900 billion greater than the Air Force. I don't begrudge them that money because they were the preponderance of forces. But guess what? We're facing a different set of threats today. And because of those disparities in funding, the Air Force is now the oldest, the smallest, and the least ready. Let me give you a couple more examples. You know what the youngest B-52 is today? How old it is? The youngest B-52, which makes up the preponderance of the United States of America's bomber force, is 63 years old. Now, how many people out there have a 1961 Buick Electra and need a new starter for it? Where are you going to get a frapping starter for a 61 Buick Electra? You might find one in a junkyard somewhere, but it's going to take time. The youngest, well, not the youngest, the most advanced trainer that the United States Air Force today is flying first flew in 1959. We've got 30-year-old, tankers, and I could go on and on and on, but I think you get my point. It's time to recapitalize our Air Force, and that takes, unfortunately, an infusion of money because we've kicked the can down the road for way too long. So back to your point that you made about Knudsen, I don't think that we have the same kind of industrial base today that we had back then. And quite frankly, to be candid, we're not going to be able to rebuild it. So what that means is we need to start accumulating particularly weapons and munitions so that we are ready. And I don't want to get down too far in a rat hole, but munitions accounts are places that all the services tend to go raid for money during peacetime because they don't have sufficient total monies. So they go to get money to try to modernize their forces. We have just simply gotten to the point in the United States Air Force, and to a degree the other services, where you can't do more with less and less and less. And so we've got to spend money on recapitalizing and modernizing our military.
Yeah, certainly technology helps on the ground quite a bit, but since the Blue Book came out, we've only added a couple of things to infantry tactics and small unit tactics, to be honest. I mean, gunfighting is gunfighting, but the air superiority and naval superiority is all about technology. And that's one of the races we're in right now. One of the issues that one of the issues we seem to have, and I hear this from people that are still inside the military right now, including members of the secretary's team. We have this issue that we tend to build systems that take years to put into service, and by the time they're put into service, the components or the capabilities are to some degree antiquated, right? I mean, this process has to be sped up somehow. I wonder. I've got a two-part question. One is, sure, how ready are we compared to China or any other country that has a large air force? And what would you do to get us ready if you were in charge? Wow.
Well, you're hitting on, and this wasn't, for the audience, this wasn't pre-coordinated. But one of the points that I wanted to make is not only is the Air Force smaller than it's ever been, it's also less ready. On any given day, only about 54% of any of the Air Force's aircraft are available. There are over 700 aircraft a day that aren't available due to maintenance and parts shortages. That's one part of the readiness equation, but the other one is, just like any operator, needs to be ready. Let me take you back to 1991 in that Desert Storm example. At the time, fighter pilots were flying an average of about 22 hours a month. That's about 3 to 4 missions a week. Today, the average is below 10 hours a month. Now, I was a young captain back in the late 70s, early 80s. My second assignment was Kadena Air Base in Okinawa, Japan, and we'd sit alert. We'd fly up to Korea and sit alert in our brand new F-15s. And we used to laugh at the Russians and the Koreans because they used to get less than 10 hours a month. Folks, that's where the United States Air Force is today. At the same time, the Chinese, who just released 2 new advanced stealth aircraft over Christmas time, are flying over 200 hours a year. So the readiness equation is switched, where the U.S. Air Force is oldest, smallest, least ready. The Chinese Air Force is the newest, the largest, and the most ready. And that's what we need to be concerned with.
I hear you mentioned something about these 700 aircraft, parts shortages or whatever. I hear this a lot, actually, from people that are still in us giving weapons systems to other countries, even though we consider them old or whatever, and even though we're selling them, there's still a cost. I hear this especially from rotary wing pilots who say that they're having trouble keeping a good amount of their birds in service because of backlogs of orders and maintenance and stuff like that. So it's not just the Air Force, it's the Navy and it's the Army's, Army and Marine Corps' rotary wing systems as well that are all having the same problem. And there's only one solution to it. It's just money. That's the only way to solve that problem. Like we want to be clever and efficient, and I want DOGE to cut the government to the bone if it's able to. But there are some things that need to be that can only be solved with money, right? And this is one of them for sure.
Yeah, and you said something that kind of triggered me. I think most of us who have been associated with the military, and I'd share with you, I've had 6 tours in the Washington D.C. area, so I'm very familiar with the Pentagon. There's lots of fat to cut. Here's the concern: don't cut the bone. You can cut to the bone, but don't cut the bone. And one of the concerns is, and again, I'm not going to get into a rabbit hole here, but we need to make sure that we cut the fat, not the bone. And you're spot on. We're way past time when we can do more with less, because we're doing less with less. And if we want to rebuild our military, we need to put the resources into it. How else do you deal with recapitalizing a bomber force that's on average, the B-52s are 63 years old? Same thing can be said about fighters. Same thing can be said about tankers, and then mobility as well.
Yeah, I mean, this has been a 30-year problem for us. Maybe a little bit longer, but it's certainly a 30-year problem. And it isn't just with, like, we'll spend plenty of money on deployments and things like that may or not be necessary, frankly. I mean, we can debate the finer points of that another time, but there's two key elements and the Air Force is the biggest one in my opinion because it's been relevant for longer. But NASA's the other one, and we'll get to that one in a minute. But the Air Force, as we mentioned before, has expanded and contracted its force over and over again. We've made some mistakes. I don't know how you feel about the F-35, but none of my friends in the Air Force are too keen on that whole project. As you say, we're the oldest. Our aircraft are the oldest they've ever been in our history, which is completely unacceptable. And then NASA's the other one. I mean, James Webb took 30 years to build. Basically, it's like 25 years to build. It was 96 to 2021, I think, is when it actually was complete before they started testing out all the moving parts and such. But that was to replace Hubble, which was, from the 70s. So it's like it took us 50 years to upgrade our capability out there. And I want to talk now about not specifically about space, but partly because space is not the final frontier necessarily, but definitely the next one. And we're in space and AI, artificial intelligence, and as a result of that energy as well, those are the races that we are in right now. We are in a space race, we are in an artificial intelligence race, and we are in an energy race with China right now. And if we don't win them, then America simply will not persist as it currently exists. That's a fact, right? So all these fancy satellites that we have floating around don't mean jack shit if we can't defend them. That's just how life works, right? So I mean, when I was in computer school, one of my professors was a Navy nuke guy, and he goes, "It doesn't matter how good your firewall is if somebody can come sit down at one of your terminals, right?" So you got to actually have physical security as well, and we don't have anything going on up there right now. And I feel like Americans as a whole don't take it as seriously as we need to. The general population, there just doesn't seem to be the excitement around this kind of stuff that there was in the 1960s.
Well, it's a wonderful topic, but can you give me, I don't know, I could do this in 30 seconds or 60 seconds to come back to something that you said.
Sure, go ahead.
About the F-35. Mm-hmm. Look, it has been the whipping person, I was going to say whipping boy for many, many years. And guess what? Rightfully so, because it has been an acquisition challenge for a variety of reasons. But guess what? So have most leading edge high technology systems. There used to be a saying when the F-16, which arguably is one of the most successful jack of all trades fighter aircraft ever built, but it used to be if you wanted to buy own an F-16, just buy an acre of land off the end of a runway because one will be planted there within the next month. So it's had teething problems. But let me use a real world example. Just a couple of months ago, U.S. manufactured F-35s flown by Israel flew 1,000 miles into the heart of Iran, which was defended by the Russians' most advanced surface-to-air missile systems. And those F-35s just didn't avoid those missile systems. It eliminated them and went on to strike other critical targets inside the heart of Iran and came back safely. That is an incredible feat. And you don't hear many people talk about that. But we can't do that with any drones that we have today. And there's no one who's a bigger advocate for drones than yours truly, because I raised them, the utility and the use of them in the Air Force by over 700% in my last job on active duty. But we have to have a balance of capabilities, and the F-35 is one of our most capable, highly advanced systems today. Okay, so with that said, And back to your discussion earlier about technology is what gives us an asymmetric advantage over our adversaries. And so we need to continue to do that. There's something called the next generation air dominance aircraft that we need to invest in, because the Russians and the Chinese are scared shitless of what the capability and capacity of that aircraft are going to be. Unfortunately, we put that on hold in the last administration, and we need to get back on with it, which becomes a problem if we're facing a continuing resolution. But I won't go down that rabbit hole either. Let's get back to NASA. So you raised an extraordinarily important point, and the one thing that I want to tie NASA back into the issue of U.S. national security is it has a key role, because having the United States maintain its lead global position in space is an imperative for the free world, not to mention our own national security. And the way that's done is through a combination of both military, commercial, as well as civil space activities. And all three of these sectors embrace our U.S. overarching belief that space should remain open and accessible to all the nations. And while, we welcome any other nation's space activity, our national leaders rightfully view China's behavior in space as extraordinarily dangerous. And we need to be able to counter that. And so I'll pause there, but I'm more than happy to talk about how we're doing that if you want to proceed down that line.
Yeah, I mean, a quick comment. We think of, people think of national security in the same way that we used to think of intelligence. And we upgraded the idea of intelligence to geospatial intelligence because one fact is just it's true in the moment and in one place, right? And that's insufficient for what we're doing. We need three-dimensional intelligence. We need four-dimensional intelligence because you have to include time in that, right? And that's what geospatial intelligence has been very popular for, let's say, the last 60 years. It's been a big, we've been really keyed in on doing that. But another part of that, and it's something that the OSS was really good at and the agency just didn't ever get good at it, was, in my opinion, was economic warfare, right? And we say a phrase like economic warfare, it doesn't mean trying to fuck other countries over. What it means is the same thing that making a strong military means, which is deterrence, right? And it happens in two ways. There's a stick and a carrot to economic warfare. And I don't even mean sanctions. I mean, allowing people the ability to participate in the economy that's happening is a carrot, and telling them they can't is a stick, obviously, right? Now, it's very true, and you can see it. This has been my position since Trump started with the Abraham Accords years ago, that he was trying to get those Arab countries more interested in money than they were in ideology. And it worked in Bahrain and Saudi Arabia. You can see them. Like MBS might be our best ally in the Mideast. That's not that at the moment, just because of the power of that country right there, and him desperately trying to turn them around. That's what can happen, right? So I think people think of NASA as just an expenditure for some reason, and I don't understand that, because one, you're using it right now to have a conversation. The fruits of their labor is being used right now to have a conversation, or your phone or any of this other shit. But also, you mentioned the commercial part of it. If we can monetize this stuff, and not just for large industry, but even down to the individual level at some point, whether you're investing in something or using stuff that comes from that program, then it's enriching everybody, not just America, by the way, but everybody on this planet. Right. We have to stop thinking about intelligence and start thinking about geospatial. And you have to stop thinking about these military programs or national security as just military defense, and start thinking about it in what it is, which is, multi-generational warfare in a lot of ways. And a big part of that is the economy, right?
Absolutely. And once again, people tend to take this for granted. Back onto your point, without what the United States, and this happens to be one of the military components provides, you can't put gas in your car. Why is that? Well, it's because the timing signal that associates with the the gas stations as well as being able to process your credit card to buy that gas. I mean, you can't. Yeah, I know. Well, let's go banking. Let me use banking as an example. You can't get access to your bank account unless you've got a fully functioning global positioning satellite system, because that goes back to the timing signal on how you get access to your bank accounts. And then there's the whole issue of the one that most people understand. You can't get from point A to point B because most people still use some sort of app, Waze or Google or this or that or the other thing to go from point A to point B. So it's not even just a U.S. Global utility, it's a global utility. So that gets involved with both commercial space as well as military space. And I think people still today aren't aware that we actually have a brand new armed service known as the U.S. Space Force that's been around since 2019, and it's working very hard to counter China's growing threat activity. And they're on the right track. But commercial space at the same time is accelerating its contributions. I don't know whether many people know this, but this past month, for the first time in decades, an American spacecraft landed on the moon. It's a company called Firefly Aerospace, and they had a lunar lander called Blue Ghost that touched down on March 2nd. And it's the first commercial spacecraft that has landed on the moon in history. That's incredible. So the commercial space is becoming just as advanced and, quite frankly, more advanced in some cases than government systems. So, okay, that's a commercial piece. Now, the third component here, and this is what's really important of America's space-powered triad, if you will, is NASA, the National Aeronautics and Space Administration. And when I was growing up, it was the premier disruptive actor during the Mercury, Gemini, and Apollo programs of the 60s and the 70s. And unfortunately, it's lost some of its mystique over the past quarter of a century because it is this once most daring agency, if you will, has become bogged down by bureaucracy, budget cuts, and erosion of its traditional daring. And we need to reverse that. We need to get it back on track.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of interesting stuff going on with all this. I mean, it isn't just, we think of GPS as a way to get around, but your phone uses it. Every telecommunications tower that exists uses time synchronization that happens from these GPS satellites. Every financial transaction from your bank, digital transactions from your bank, all the way up to the New York Stock Exchange are time-stamped using that system. And that's a requirement by federal law, by the way. And if it doesn't happen, then you don't get your money. You know what I mean? Then the backbone of the internet, all the data servers, the cloud that we so much rely on now, uses the exact same thing. I mean, there's the information that you have access to, whether it's locally downloaded or you access it from the cloud, and then those databases replicate over. I don't want to get too in the weeds, but the databases replicate. And one of the things that happens, it used to be MD5, but there's different appended checksums on these things, and one of them is a timestamp. I sent this at this time, you received it at this time. If they don't match up, then the data gets corrupted. All this stuff happens as a result of this GPS satellite that we think is just for us driving from here to our grandma's house. You know what I mean? But there's so much other stuff going on there. And then you mentioned this a minute ago, and I want to get into this now. We're losing a lot of our asymmetric capabilities right now. That's why I think we're focusing back on a near peer situation, because everyone's got drones and everybody's got night vision now. You can buy that shit on the internet. You can buy it on Amazon now. You know what I mean? Whether how good it is or not is another question, but you can definitely get it. And I mentioned Bill Knudsen before. We need now more than ever, and we saw it with just the first couple months of Trump's presidency and locking down the border. Leadership matters. It might matter more than anything else. And the guy who's currently being pushed for NASA administrator is Jacek Isaacman, And I've talked about him on this show, or Jared, excuse me. I've talked about him on this show before. He is a very interesting dude. He's been to space himself, which is always a good qualification for somebody that's trying to get involved. I don't know if NASA's ever had an administrator before who had been to space before, especially not as a civilian.
Actually, the most recent NASA administrator, I'm having a bit of a senior moment now.
Nelson?
He'd been to space.
Oh, that's awesome.
As a senator. But Jared, as you mentioned, is someone that President Trump really made the right move with respect to picking him, in my humble opinion, because NASA more than ever needs a bold, results-driven leader who is experienced in developing space technology and also able to inspire that change and disrupt stagnation and hold people accountable to move forward. And that's exactly what Jared can do and what he brings to the forefront, if you will. Truth in lending, I had the good fortune, I've known Jared for over a decade now. I was one of his advisory board members to one of the companies that he owns, Draken International, which was one of the first large-scale private companies that provided adversary air support to U.S. military services. And what that means is, you got simulated bad guys or red air that, the U.S. Air Forces of all the services that would fly against, and they'd imitate the enemy, and we'd practice against them. But at the same time, he's got some insight into how the Department of Defense works, and into government contracting and risk mitigation and all that stuff associated with the government. But at the same time, he's got a real strong business acumen, because he founded a payment processing company and built it into a multi-billion-dollar international operation. So here's someone who's got those experiences, and he's a trained pilot himself. As you mentioned, he's flown in space twice. He led the first all-private crew into orbit on Inspiration 4.
First spacewalk by civilians as well, I believe.
Yeah, well, I was just going to say, that's when he commanded the Polaris Dawn mission and performed the first civilian spacewalk. So he is uniquely qualified to ensure U.S. preeminence in space. And fundamentally, kind of, summarizing all of this from my perspective, he's someone who understands that NASA's success is intertwined with America's national security. And that's why it's extraordinarily important, in my humble opinion, that he gets confirmed as the new NASA administrator. Now, there's no reason to think that he will not, but I think he's a perfect pick for that job.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I don't know that it'll be interesting. I can't wait for these hearings to happen, to be honest, just to see. He's not. There won't be adversarial. There's no reason that he's not going to get confirmed. He's got great experience and stuff. But I do hope they kind of get in the weeds in it, because it'll be really interesting. They made a doc about the whole Inspiration 4 thing that's available on Netflix. We had Scott Poteet on the show before, and we talked about that. He's a great dude. But yeah. Jared is checked out on MiG-29s. I mean, you talking about red air and stuff like that.
Right.
We a lot of people listening to this show were either in the military or something else, maybe law enforcement. You know what red cell planning is? I mean, we try to think about what the enemy's going to do, and then we have opposition forces, OP4 we call it, go up there and try to pretend fight them and stuff like that. Well, he was doing it himself in a MiG-29, which is pretty impressive. He's not just some dude. He's not just some. He's not Elon Musk. And when I don't mean that as an insult to Musk. Musk is a brilliant man. He's doing a lot of great stuff. And they both come from a payment processing background and coding and stuff like that. But whereas Elon is developing and engineering tech as a primary, Jared is actually up in the bird flying the damn thing, which is insane to me, right? I mean, a civilian that even has the temerity to do something like that is pretty wild.
Yep. No, like I say, he is the right guy. He's been there, done that, both in terms of business and in terms of flying fighters and in terms of operating and commanding spacecraft. You just don't get any better than that.
It's such a unique series of experiences that he's had, like founding and then running a major billion-dollar company, and then also sitting between the private sector and the DoD especially, right? Gives you, like you mentioned it before, but that could be a complicated job to have sometimes. And he's done it very well. So hopefully this gets done sooner than later. And then also hopefully, I think we need to do a better job as a country and especially the DoD and NASA specifically, or rather the Pentagon and NASA collectively, about articulating the national security purpose of NASA. It's not just about taking pictures of stuff that's far away. That's right. Something that they do, but that's not really the point. I love astronomy. It's my favorite thing to think about, to be honest. I love space, but I also enjoy not speaking Russian. So if we could move this along a little bit, that would be absolutely great. There's one other thing I wanted to ask you before we get out of here.
Sure.
The U.S. is working on a 6th generation fighter, and every now and again you'll hear some information come out about it. I know a big part of it is AI, and a big, like we've made, I know this just from having friends that worked on it, and this is all public information, but we've made some extreme advancements in what we used to call Blue Force Tracker, and it involves AI and stuff like that. And then there's all this other tech that we have now, like gait recognition and facial recognition and all this other stuff that can be plugged into a system like this. What do you know about our progress on the 6th gen fighter and what it might look like, just some of the features?
Yeah, well, it's a fascinating topic. It goes back to some of the things that you mentioned. Really depend upon the United States engineer, military, and design processes having the most advanced capabilities that exist in the world today. When it comes to 6th generation aircraft, what I try to convey to people is that we're not talking about just a better version of the P-51, okay, World War II fighter, or an F-4, or even an F-15. And in many respects, the fighter designation is a bit anachronistic. This happened when we first built the F-22. And I like to tell people, look, the F-22 and the F-35, they're not Fs. They're FBEARCEWAWCS, okay, 22s and 35s. And that's what the next generation air dominance penetrating counter-air aircraft is going to be. It is an information machine that is able, because of its stealth, to penetrate adversary air defenses, collect information, and sense what's going on, and then share that back with the decision makers to give the United States military a decision advantage over our adversaries. And that's how we'll end up winning. But without those capabilities, we're not going to be able to do that. And that's why America needs to invest in its next generation, 6th generation aircraft.
Yeah, I've discussed some of these capabilities before, but the ability to, move into enemy territory and capture a real geospatial picture of the battle space and immediately send that back to the entire everybody else in your battle space, if not all the way back to Washington, is something that nobody can do.
Well, you don't want to go back that far. No micromanagement from 8,000-mile screwdrivers.
Well,
It's providing. I'm reinforcing what you said. We want to enable the warfighters at the bleeding edge with the information that gives them decision superiority.
Yeah. I mean, the way I would set it up is it's one-way traffic back to the Pentagon.
Okay,
you can see,
that's
but
good.
you can't speak. All right.
Oh, there you go. I'll buy into that.
That's
been one of our challenges in the past. You have decision makers who should be staying at the strategic level, trying to reach down to the tactical level. And as it's one of the things that I teach general officers when I have the opportunity to do so is, look, when you get promoted to these senior ranks, you need to operate at those senior levels, not get down into the business that you used to be very good at 30 years ago, and enable the war fighters to be able to accomplish and capitalize on the capabilities that they have, because they're the ones who are most aware of what's going on in the battle space.
I couldn't agree more. Certainly, maybe it translates, maybe it doesn't, but being in the infantry and being told how to go do stuff was not my biggest, it wasn't the thing I liked the most about being in the infantry, probably the least. So now you're the Dean of the Mitchell Institute for Aerospace Power Studies. I assume that's named after Billy Mitchell.
Absolutely.
What is it that you guys do, and what are you working on these days?
Well, actually, what we exist to do is to educate the American public on the virtues and values of what operating in air and space bring to our security writ large, if you will. Part of this is also increasing awareness of what you gave me the opportunity to speak about a little bit earlier, and that's the need to recapitalize, rebuild an Air Force that's been in a nosedive for 30 years, and we need to pull it out of a nosedive, which gets us right to what you just asked, is what are we working on? You know, we just released a paper right here, Air Force and Space Force Vectors for the Incoming Trump Defense Team, all right? All right, so you're going to have more money. What are you going to do with it? And that's what this does. This outlines where we can optimally use the resources to make America's air and space forces great again. So that's what we're up to, and that's what I'll continue doing until my dying day.
It's the first entry, by the way, on mitchellaerospacepower.org. If you go to the publication section, it's the one at the top. So if you're interested in that sort of thing, definitely go read it. And I would love to see some of the stuff you guys are doing put into a serious documentary series about the history of aerospace power, modernity, and then what the future is going to look like. I think, for better or worse, people respond to that sort of thing. You know what I mean? A lot of people join the Air Force because of Top Gun. A lot of people join the SEALs because of Navy SEALs. A lot of people join the Green Berets because of John Wayne and Rambo. This is how we communicate with the public sometimes. It's necessary. I would love to see some more of that stuff. And I know the Army's working on something now for their 250th anniversary, which is going to be super cool. Hopefully we can get some funding and do this as well, because, it's the Army. I love the Army. I love being in the Army. I loved getting into fights and blowing shit up and all that stuff. But space is cool. It's cooler. Come on, let's be real about it, man. Jumping out of a plane and then landing on the ground in 10 seconds with a fucking sprained ankle, that's not cool. There's nothing cool about that. Any rate, yeah.
I agree with you 1,000%, but I'll go back to what I said before, is we need the strongest Army, Navy, Air Force, Marine Corps, Space Force in the world. And it takes all. And that's one of the virtues that we have over our adversaries, is that we think in a joint construct and understand and value the contributions of everyone. And I have to share with you, one of the moments that made me feel the proudest in my entire career was when I was a commander of a Joint Task Force Operation Northern Watch, and overseeing no-fly zone operations in northern Iraq. And we had a Patriot battery that helped protect us. And the commander of that battery, when he was rotating out, came to me one day and said, "Sir, if I ever have the opportunity to work for you again, I would just really enjoy it." And it's sort of like, okay, That's an Army lieutenant colonel telling an Air Force brigadier general that and he wasn't trying to suck up to me. He didn't have to. He was leaving after a 45-day rotation. But everyone contributes, and it has been magnificent to have this time with you. I've really, really enjoyed it. And if I can ever be of assistance to you, just reach out and let me know.
I will, sir. I really appreciate your time today. And just before we get out of here, tell everybody about Mitchell Aerospace, where it is, and what kind of information they can find on your platform.
Yeah, we're located, as you might think, just outside of Washington, D.C. in Arlington, Virginia. Just Google Mitchell Institute for Aerospace Studies. Get on our website. You'll find a whole series of not just reports, but we also put out a weekly podcast on topics of interest and what's going on. Podcasts tend to be a little bit more candid than some of the video webinars that we do, but we do webinars with leaders from not just the Air Force and the Space Force, but also the combatant commands to keep people up to speed on what's going on with America's defense. So thanks again for the opportunity. Look us up and reach out and let us what we can do to help you.
Yes, sir. I appreciate the time today. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And thank you all for listening. This has been Citizen.